to the GDG. This is our second meeting of the term, and today we have the pleasure to be joined by David Owens, who is Professor of Philosophy at King's College London. David, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for inviting me. The last time I was here, about 3 years ago, was in the lecture room over there with the glass ceiling, and I was replying to Joseph Raz, or responding to Joseph Raz, whatever the right verb is, on normative power. And here I am again. And as you will have seen, if you read the paper, Raz is the single most cited person or discussed person, and that was my experience of the last 20 years. If you had to think a thing through, what you should do first is think carefully about what Joseph said, and you might end up thinking the same thing, in which case you try and think about something else, or else you think something different, which is what happened in the case of authority. But in any case, the first port of call is Joseph's work and thinking it through extremely slowly. So I'm sorry he's gone. Okay, so authority. So this paper is diagnostic. I'm not going to try and justify authority. I'm going to try and say what I think is distinctively problematic about that mode of social influence. There are lots of modes of social influence: request, advice, advertising, coercion, so on. But commanding someone or ordering someone to do something is a distinctive mode of social influence, which is problematic in its own special way. Many people have felt that. Now, when people have tried to explain why they feel that, they often explain it by connecting command with coercion. So they think that if you're entitled to command someone, you're entitled to enforce your orders. Now, I think there is a connection there, but I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm going to forget about coercion. I'm going to try and explain the problematic stuff in terms of command. So it's important for my purposes to distinguish, as Hart did, in fact, commands from coercive orders. So the bank robber puts the gun to the head of the bank clerk. There you have a request. He's asking for the money, backed up by a threat. Right? And that's a different phenomenon from command, even though it uses the imperative form, the grammatical form, because the bank robber is not pretending that the clerk is in any way obliged to obey the bank robber. That's not what that's not their mode of operation. Whereas in the case of command, the commander is purporting that the commanded is obliged to obey them. So it's a different kind of mechanism for persuading someone to do something. So I'm going to take it that command is an exercise of a deontic power. Let's go back to what we were talking about 3 years ago. So the definition of command is on page 3 or 4 of the paper you've got, and I've written it up there, probably in invisible ink, but never mind. To command someone is to do something. Command someone to do something is to communicate the intention of hereby putting them under an obligation to do it, of obliging them to do it by the communication of this very intention. Okay? So you're trying to create an obligation, put them under an obligation by telling them, I'm hereby putting you under an obligation. That's what happens in command. That's what you're trying to do. And I'll express that mouthful by saying you do it by declaration. So this is what declaration means up here. And that's all I want to say about the nature of command at the moment. That leaves a lot of stuff open, says nothing about how powers of command are justified, doesn't say anything about whether if the guy doesn't do it, he's wronging the commanded. Don't say anything about that. All I'm saying is what's in that paragraph. So lots of interesting issues are left open. By obligation, I'm not going to say much about obligation other than obligation is a kind of special reason to do something. Its specialness is much debated. And also, if you don't do it, you're blameworthy. Blame reactions are appropriate. Right? So that's the general idea of obligation I'm using, but hopefully I'm not going to say anything very controversial about that. Okay, so that's command. So it might be helpful to start by contrasting it with request, or asking someone to do something. So that's, I think Joseph was right when he said that's also a normative power. If you ask someone to do something, you're creating a reason for them to do it by declaration. You're not just expressing a wish for them to do it. You can express a wish without asking them to do it, as he pointed out. So ask someone to do it is to give them a reason to do it by declaration. And then you might say, well, then the difference between commands and requests is obvious, because requests, and Joseph did say this, requests don't impose obligations, commands do. But that's not actually true in general. If if my best friend asks me to help them move house, that will, in very many contexts, oblige me to move house. They will, by saying that, create an obligation on me to move house, to help them move house. So it's not the mere creation of obligation, it's rather the mechanism by which the obligation is created. In the case of the request, what you create is a reason, and in the context of the relationship, that constitutes an obligation. But you don't command your friend to do this. You don't order them to do it. You don't say, I am hereby obliging you to do it by saying this. Right? That's out of place in modern friendship. And if you did say that, they'd have a good excuse for not doing it. So it's important to ask and not to demand in that context. So there's quite different force to these speech acts. And even when, you're not entitled to order your friends around, but even when you are, wise commanders do not command unless they request. You must have had a boss who asked you to do something, and you knew perfectly well that they could order you to do it, but they're choosing not to do that because that's kind of the last resort. So of course your attitude is influenced by the fact that they can do that, but they're not purporting to do it at the moment. They're just asking you to do it. That's a very different force and a very different feel. And if it's problematic in a less severe and different way. Okay, so there's this distinctive mechanism of creating obligations by declaration. But there's something else going on, I think, which is the thing I want to focus on for most of the talk, which is what I call a transfer of responsibility for compliance. So in the case of the request, if my friend asks me to help him move house and I do it and my family complains because I'm not home for dinner in time, the buck stops with me. I've got to justify myself to them, right? I can't say I acted in my friend's name, I acted on their authority, I was their representative. I can't say any of those things, right? I can't pass the buck to my commanding officer, as it were. That's not what's going on with the request. Whereas with the soldier, that is what's going on. So if the soldier is ordered to do something, they're being asked to do it on the authority of the commanding officer. They're being asked to do it in the name of the officer or the army or the state or whatever it is. And if someone complains about the fact that they've been ordered to confiscate your car, let's say, because the military needs it, they get to pass the buck to the person who delivered the order. Ask him why we're doing it. I'm not doing it, as it were. Well, I am doing it in some sense, but in another very important sense, I'm not doing it. In a way, I am doing it if I accede to someone's request or decide to do what my friends ask them to do. Okay. Now, one way of thinking about this is to say, it's true that something's going on here, and that's something like this, that the commander is providing the commanded with a justification for doing the commanded act. And of course, if you do that, you kind of get to be responsible for it, if you provide someone with a justification for doing something, and then they do it. So why isn't that all that's going on? In which case it would be quite unmysterious. But I don't think that is all that's going on. Because for one thing, all that a justification, giving someone a justification does is it enables you to share responsibility for what they're doing. It doesn't take away responsibility from them for what they're doing. So if someone gives me a justification for giving this paper by saying, you'll be paid lots of money, maybe I will, then sure, they're sharing in responsibility for my giving it, but I don't lose responsibility as a result for accepting this justification. So it's different from the order. And also, another interesting thing about orders is that what you have here is you have a sphere of operations where the officer is in charge of the soldier's behaviour in a certain sphere. And they're actually responsible for what the soldier does, even if the soldier disobeys them or acts in that sphere without an explicit order. Then if the soldier does something, takes the wrong car, let's say, the officer gets to complain to the soldier, but the general public come to the officer. So that's the structure there. So there's still a transfer of responsibility even if there's disobedience, or even if there's no order at all, provided it's within the right sphere of operations. So we can't, justification's not going to do it. There's something else going on here apart from justification. The other thing you might try is excuse, that the order excuses compliance. And of course, when you've got an excuse, you're not responsible in quite the way you are if you don't have an excuse. So that's why the order, and the advantage of the excuse is you actually get deprived of responsibility. You don't just get to share it, right? But that's not what's going on either, because the soldier is still fully responsible to the officer for obeying the order. So if they're disobedient, they are fully responsible for that to the officer, and the officer will punish them or blame them or whatever they're going to do with them. So it's not that they're being taken out of the nexus of responsibility altogether in the way that excuse does. What's happening is they're being turned into a satellite of the commander. So they have relationships of responsibility to the commander, they're obliged to obey them and stuff like that, but they're insulated from the wider deontic nexus, and everything goes through the commander. So that they're what I call a deontic satellite of the commander. And excuse won't produce that effect, and nor will justification. So you've got a different kind of phenomenon here. Okay. Now I say that, so when the commander does this, he's trying to get the commanded to act on their authority and in their name and so on. So he's purporting to assume responsibility for compliance. So it's not just compliance that is looked for, it's obedience. And obedience is a narrower phenomenon, I think, which involves this kind of transfer of responsibility in a way that compliance need not. You can comply with someone's request, you can fulfill the promise you've made to them, you're still responsible. The buck still stops with you. But orders are different. And obedience is this distinctive phenomenon which the commander is looking for. Now, all sorts of complications here, which I won't go into. The commander might not succeed in getting the responsibility off if you have conflicting authorities, or if it's beyond their jurisdiction. So lots of complications. But in the simple, pure case, that's what happens. The command is felicitous and responsibility gets transferred. And this is all different from, asking someone to keep their promises or do the obligations of friendship. That doesn't involve this transfer. Just a point of clarification, there's two ways of hearing transfer of responsibility. One is a way of hearing it which is weaker and will no doubt garner a lot of agreement, which is something like transfer of liability, in particular legal liability, but perhaps other forms of liability. And by liability, I mean responsibility for costs or compensation or something like that. Now, I think most people would agree that it is perfectly possible to transfer liability from one person to another, for one person to accept the responsibility of paying compensation or paying costs to third parties for what another party has done. I assume that's not a controversial phenomenon. Might be things of detail about it, but people won't think it's impossible or conceptually problematic. But many people will think that the phenomenon I'm interested in, which one might call transfer of moral responsibility or transfer of blameworthiness, some people will think that is kind of mysterious or even nonsensical, because they'll think something like, well, look, moral responsibility and blameworthiness is a function of stuff like your intentions and your motives and what you knew and the consequences of your action. And none of that is to be affected simply by declaration, by people making announcements. They've got to do something else to affect who's responsible. So this whole idea of transferring responsibility by declaration is a myth. Right. Now that raises some deep issues, and all I want to do here is point out that these are not new issues, that they are exactly the same issues that are raised by the general idea of normative power. So if I make a promise, I create an obligation. I bind myself, and I do so by declaration. So I change the content of my obligations. in a way that may have no great relation to anyone's interest in what's going on or whether it'll be good for them and all that kind of stuff. So it looks as if I can transform the normative situation by declaration, by making a promise and so on. So why should it be, if that's right, I mean, maybe some people don't believe that, of course, but it's the same issue. If I can do that, why can't I transfer the locus of responsibility by declaration and change the normative situation in a different respect? Why is that any more mysterious? Okay, right. And here's my thought about authority, that what's distinctively problematic about command and authority is that purporting to transfer responsibility, sucking up the responsibility from the subject. That's the distinctive thing. Now, you might say, well, you know, don't people like losing responsibility often? You know, wouldn't it be nice not to be responsible for nasty decisions and so on? So what's the problem? And complicated, that's no doubt true a lot of the time. So let certainly discuss this in the discussion, but I'll just back off to the weaker claim that where people find something distinctively problematic about authority and the exercise of, they're finding the problem to be this transfer of responsibility. Of course, they may not feel it as a problem, in which case they won't think there's something problematic about this exercise of authority. But insofar as they do, and insofar as they think it's distinctive of authority, that's what they're worried about. That's the claim I'm going to make. But maybe people like being bossed around something, so fair enough. Right, I'm going to miss out the third section, which is all about the law, because I'm among lawyers, so I don't want to talk about the law. And I don't have time, fortunately. So, sorry?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, oh really, okay, right. I'll just move on then. So now, the other thing I want to do, apart from diagnose the problem, is to say why a certain kind of solution to the problem has seemed to be appealing to people. And that is a solution that depends on choice and agreement, that people choose or consented or agreed to the authority. And I want to say why, not that that's the right solution, but why it seemed to be appealing given the nature of the problem. I mean, I only have 10 minutes, so maybe I should skip over the choice, forget about choice. Let's move to the normative powers like promise and consent. You might think, since this command is a normative power, and a bit of poison, as it were, you should expect the antidote to have the same character, namely be an exercise of normative power. So promising to comply with someone's orders might be a good way of getting under their authority. So we suppose that we all had our convention and promised to obey Boris, and that's why Boris is in charge of us. Right? But that, if I'm right, that's not going to give us the right result, because people are responsible for fulfilling the promises they make. They don't get to pass the responsibility for that to the person they made the promise to. Right? In a way, they do get to pass the buck to their commander if they're given an order. So the promise to comply won't give the right shape of result. So we need something that's different from a promise to comply, and we get closer to it if we get to the idea of authorization, the kind of thing which you do to your lawyer. So you authorize your lawyer can then act in your name, make contracts in your name, make deals in your name, and then you do what they do. And insofar as they are entitled to do that, they've got to obey you. They're obliged to obey you, not just to act in your interests, but actually to obey your commands within the scope of the authorization. So you have this idea of obedience and authority alongside this idea that responsibility has been transferred, that they're your representative, that they can act in your name. So that's the right combination of ideas. And it's getting us away from the idea that someone simply, like the barber, you give permission to the barber to cut your hair, but when he cuts your hair, it's him cutting your hair, it's not you, right? Whereas when you authorize your lawyer to sell your house, it's you that's selling your house, not just the lawyer. So there's a different kind of thing going on here. Okay, which is connected to the idea that these lawyers have got to obey you. Okay, hurry on. So now, this is not going to entirely solve the problem because I can still, if I have my lawyer and my lawyer's making contracts for me, I can still make contracts. So I haven't relinquished my power of making contracts. I've simply allowed him to use that power or use that right. I haven't done away with it. Right? So in order to get to full bore authority, political authority in particular, we need to do what Hobbes said you need to do. You need to transfer your right, to relinquish your right, not just to allow someone else to use your right. And that's what Hobbes thought happened when you institute a political authority. You transfer your rights over your bodily movements and your money and stuff like that, if you had any rights over your money, certainly your bodily movements, to the authority, who then can give you commands in respect of your bodily movements. That leaves a lot of stuff open. That institution might be time limited. It might be over a certain number of matters and not over certain other matters. So we needn't be an absolutist and an authoritarian in the way that Hobbes was in order to operate with the Hobbesian model. So those are further questions of detail. But the model has the right effects in producing the transfer of responsibility. So then you have this interesting situation where the agent can demand obedience from the principal. So in the case of the lawyer, you don't get to obey the lawyer, right? You don't get to obey your lawyer because he's acting in your name. But in the case when you institute an authority, the authority can demand obedience from you because you've actually relinquished your right to them, not just allowed them to use it. So the sovereign acts in the name of the subjects when they levy a tax or declare war on a neighbour. And the subjects act in the name of the sovereign when they obey the sovereign by paying the tax or serving in the war. So you have this nice mutual representation going on and nexus of obedience and transfer of responsibility. So you have formally you have the type of thing we're looking for. And that, as I say, leaves a lot of other details open. Okay, so that it seems to me that something like that would solve the problem I've described. It's the kind of thing you'd need to look for to solve the problem. And I think, one of the problems with Joseph's thoughts about authority, engaging and profound as they were, was that he ended up making no sense of the consent idea. And I think that's because he didn't quite get the problem. He thought the problem was surrender of judgment in a very broad sense rather than transfer of responsibility. And once you give surrender of judgment a much narrower construal than he does, then you can see why consent is such an appealing solution, or agreement, or these normative power-based ideas. So it makes sense of a certain philosophical tradition, the liberal tradition, or a certain part of the liberal tradition. Now, this doesn't... Two over here, right, yes. So lots of problems with this. Nobody ever promised to obey Boris. No one ever instituted. If they did, we're not connected with them. We don't worry about such things when we worry about whether to obey the government. And also, as Joseph pointed out, states claim enormous scope of authority over their citizens. And that looks like slavery, looks like the kind of thing you probably ought not to agree to. So there are all sorts of practical problems with this idea of an active institution. But there's also the issue of principle as to authorization is a very familiar phenomenon, having agents, presumably that serves an important interest, which people have. So we ought to be able to justify that, and we need another kind of interest to justify the rather different power of institution. So there's lots of problems here and lots of scope for theoretical inquiry. But I think what I hope to have done is the diagnostic thing of explaining what the problem is and why this solution seems like has seemed like the right way to go for so many people, despite its obvious and patent difficulties. Thank you.